Years after The Evil Dead was released, Sam Raimi was actually pretty uninterested in a follow up. He went on to write and direct Crime Wave, which he thought was going to be a massive hit. Irvin Shapiro, a publicist who was primarily responsible for the mainstream release of The Evil Dead, wanted him to make Evil Dead 2, but Raimi was highly against it. That is, until Crime Wave massively flopped, and only then did he decide to make a sequel. Originally, the sequel Raimi had in mind was supposed to be Ash going back to the Middle Ages. Dino De Laurentiis, who initially wanted Raimi to direct Thinner, was urged by Stephen King himself to fund the film. De Laurentiis was initially skeptical, but ultimately gave in and gave them a smaller budget so the box office profit would be greater, but because of this, the Middle Ages storyline had to be scrapped. Childhood friend of Sam Raimi, Scott Spiegel, eventually told Raimi that the sequel should probably be more of a comedy, as those are the films they made during their youth. Raimi agreed and went for a mix of comedy horror, being inspired by the Three Stooges, and slapstick comedy. Despite being a direct sequel, Raimi couldn't get the rights to his own film to use, nor did any of the old actors want to return to shoot a new recap. Many things were changed, hence why many people thought this was a remake and not a sequel. My thoughts on this film are pretty differing towards everyone else's thoughts on the film. I really enjoyed this film, don't get me wrong, but everyone else pretty much unanimously agrees that Evil Dead 2 is far superior to the first and third films. However, I don't exactly agree, but I'll get to that in a minute. Evil Dead 2 is still really goddamn fun. The first time I watched it, I liked it, but thought it was fine at best. But I've watched it a few times since then, and have appreciated the film more and more. Bruce Campbell is definitely a lot better here than in the first film, and the amount of abuse he takes in the first half or so of the movie is absolutely fucking hilarious. That is definitely where the movie shines, when Campbell is pretty much acting as a one-man show with the occasional appearance from a dead-eyed Linda. When the other characters enter the picture, it's still weird and fun, but it definitely goes downhill and is not as entertaining as the first half. The characters are ungodly annoying and are just cannon fodder for the Deadites. I do think that this and one other reason is why I prefer the first film. The other reason being is that The Evil Dead is one of those movies that just can't be replicated or beat, as we saw with the remake, as entertaining as it is. It just has this surreal tone, amazing story, likable characters, and the strange balance of exceptional horror and tension and weird dark comedy. For me, it works on every level, and despite Campbell's acting being inferior to his later movies, I think everything else about the first movie just kinda magically works. A lot of people said that The Evil Dead 2 is the first, but done better, but the problem is, the first is already amazing as is and didn't need to be quote unquote done better, because it was already done great on its own. This is what the remake recognized. It had similar story beats and characters, but it went in an entirely different direction, and I appreciated that. Not saying that the remake is better than 2, definitely not, but I think people seem to forget what an absolute fucking achievement in indie filmmaking the first was. The fact that Raimi, Tappert, Campbell, and the rest of the cast and crew did what they did and what they accomplished should be decorated in the movie history books, but it is unfortunately undermined by 2 by its slightly better quality. But this isn't a review of the first, it's a review of the second. Sorry for going off track. Evil Dead 2 is a great film, and absolutely hilarious. While the second half isn't as good as the first half, I think the climax kinda makes up for it. In terms of comparisons to the original, though, I think Evil Dead 2 should be seen as its own beast. It's a great horror comedy, and I highly recommend it, but I still feel that the first is such a unique specimen of filmmaking that it should really be separated from its sequels. I try to view them as The Evil Dead, Dead by Dawn, and Army of Darkness. 3 completely different movies that just so happen to have the same protagonist. Evil Dead 2 is a great fucking movie and a great sequel, but really should not undermine the first as much as it has.